There's hardly a day go by that we do not read about new examples of pressure and the results of this pressure on the lives of the citizens. We are under a mounting tension which for the first time in the history of Western man seems to have gotten completely out of control. The individual finds no quick and easy solution, and he cannot fall back upon any of the defenses which at one time protected him, often against himself. When the tempo of the daily living was less intense, the individual was able to sink back into a certain relaxation by simply adjusting himself to the conditions around him. Today, the conditions around him are just as tension-ridden as himself. There seems to be no easy escape from the constant building of these pressure patterns. We have less leisure, less time for thought. We have obsessed and possessed our lives with so many interests, attitudes, beliefs, and opinions that we find quietude almost impossible of accomplishment. Another point that seems to play an important part in this is our loss of self-discipline. We are unable to do anything that we do not want to do. This attitude seems to take into no consideration the fact that some forms of self-discipline are comparatively easy. If any effort is required of the individual, contrary to his own inclinations, he feels that he is being persecuted unreasonably, dominated or frustrated in some manner. This problem of the crisis over cigarettes is a good example of our general condition. Actually, cigarettes are not especially habit-forming. They are not an addiction like alcohol or narcotics, but the individual permits them to become such an addiction. He inevitably finds that to give up any habit is as difficult as to give up an addiction. He has not the courage to do anything that he hasn't done, or to stop doing anything that he does do. And under this complete deterioration of his internal morale, he is losing most of his graces and charms and most of the reasons which have made him a lovable creature down through time. There has to be an answer for this, and the answer is very obvious. That all habits have to be built. A habit is the result of repetition. The habit is the result of the individual being accustomed to a course of action. If he becomes accustomed to it, it is comparatively easy for him to stay with this habit. If he has created no such habit mechanism, it is very difficult for him to follow any consistent course of procedure. The young man coming out of school has a habit. He has the habit of attendance regularly over a period of years. If he turns from this to employment, he finds a comparatively congenial situation. He just keeps on going about the same time and under the same conditions. If, however, he remains unemployed for several years, then he finds employment extremely difficult. And the more often he is out of a job, the harder it is for him to work, because he has lost his habit patterns. And these habit patterns, which act as a kind of discipline, once we lose the benefit of them, we have no more of this self-discipline, this discipline that is naturally the result of action or conditions under which we live. Habits also arise in the mental and emotional life of the individual. We begin by worrying once, and then we worry occasionally, and we end worrying all the time. We start with a situation in which perhaps we feel it is necessary to correct an individual for some action. Very soon, perhaps, we correct them too frequently, and after a time we nag incessantly. All of these attitudes arise from the continuance of one pattern, which at the beginning we could have changed by a very simple decision. But later this pattern becomes so deeply set in our subconscious that it comes again to the foreground even when we do not want it to. We finally have to settle down and fight it out with a habit. Some habit that we have set up ourselves by our own instincts, by our own personal feelings. A habit which perhaps had meaning 10 years ago and has none today. So in this problem of pressure and tension that we are dealing with, this habit mechanism has to be considered. Most people are doing things that keep them under tension, things which were not worth doing and never will be. Some individuals find that nervous tension results in an inevitable, involuntary restlessness. The individual has the habit of never being still. This is one of the strong habits of most Western people. It has been considered a virtue. If an individual is quiet, we suspect him of the worst. We do not know how to cope with him. But as the result of the creation of artificial activity, for which we have a remarkable genius, we are at something every moment. Yet at the end of the day, the end of the month, or the end of the year, we are forced to admit that this activity has been largely non-productive. We maintain this high pressure for several months, and at the end of this time, our affairs are no better off than they were in the first place. This energy, this effort has not been expended to advance purposes. It has been simply expended by habit, by outbursts of emotion and attitude which have no real reason for their own existence. But we keep on doing it, and it seems as though we are going to continue in this general direction. Actually, tension is also a community affair, a collective of some nature. In a family especially, the reduction of tension is a project in which all the members must unite to a certain degree. It's hard to imagine that we're going to be able to achieve a relaxed state if some of the members of a group desperately resist relaxation. Here in the West, we have very little appreciation for the contented spirit or the quiet heart. We must be discontented in order to be successful, and we have to be exhausted in order to have the supreme status symbol of being busy. This does not have much to do with what we are doing. It is merely that we are continuously expending energy in some way. So considering the problem as it comes down to most of us and affects us very deeply in our personal affairs, we have to recognize what apparently we were intended to discover from this whole procedure, and that is the power of the individual over the circumstances of his own life. He has to learn that if he is willing to give a lifetime of energy to making a few dollars, he must also bestow some energy upon the process of making an individual out of himself. The individual has disappeared. We are all, as it were, passengers on one boat, and when the storm comes and the boat rocks, we all rock with it. The time must sometime arrive in which we begin to recognize that these matters are largely individual problems. If you look around you in society, you will be able to notice this pattern rather clearly. Situations that make you nervous do not disturb your neighbor. And he has tension situations that do not annoy you. He finds many things pleasurable that you find unpleasant. You find pleasant things which are meaningless to him. Thus it is not the situation, it is the personal attitude toward it. The more we develop likes and dislikes to an unreasonable intensity, the more belligerent we become over our attitudes, and the more demanding we are upon the mental and emotional actions of others, the more tension we are going to develop. So here is one little situation, or one little pattern, on which perhaps we can all do a little constructive work. One way to break tension is, if possible, to prevent it from accumulating. If the tension of the day can be worked out that day, we will have gained a certain kind of victory. The small tensions by themselves can sometimes be smoothed over. But if we allow them to accumulate, if we allow the tensions to multiply in various areas until a note of confusion enters into our effort to cope with tension, then we are immediately at a disadvantage. If there is something that arises in our daily lives that requires a sudden burst of energy, we should give this situation sufficient thought and attention to try to attempt a solution. One attitude, for example, that may help is the ability to come around to a yes and no decision more or less immediately. Today we are inclined to put these things off. If we don't want to do it, we tell the other person, well, we'll think about it maybe next week. Gradually, too much is pushed into next week, and when next week catches up to us, we're ready for a nervous breakdown. If it's coming along, try to get rid of it immediately in the simplest possible manner. Another problem that very often arises with this kind of situation is our unwillingness or our dislike to offend other people. We do not like to say no when we know they want us to say yes. And even if the matter is trivial, we go along with them in order to give them pleasure or make life apparently more enjoyable, richer for them. This can be carried to an extreme, however. And under the present situation, there is much to point out that a no answer to a question is not as unwelcome as we might first think it is going to be. So many of the social obligations of living are simply habits, and sometimes other people feel that they have a responsibility to do certain things. Now, this came up not more than 2 or 3 days ago. An individual phoned inviting someone else to a social activity. The person invited didn't know what to do. They didn't want to go, but they were afraid they would offend the other individual. So finally they accepted, much to the disappointment of the person who invited them. The person had hoped desperately that the other person would say no, because the invitation was a duty invitation in the first place. And had the meeting never come off, everyone would have been just as happy and contented. So there are times when it is necessary to recognize this fact. It is also sometimes necessary for people to realize that they do their friends a great service by not involving them in unnecessary responsibilities during such a hectic period of living. We know people that move 62 miles out in the country and expect all their friends to call on them every 2 or 3 days. The situation is ridiculous. If we move ourselves into some area which is practically uninhabited, it is more or less an indication that we prefer to be alone, and our friends may assume this. On rare occasions, it is possible to socialize. But a person who isolates himself from everyone he knows in this way should not be offended if his friends are not very frequent in their visitations. Why should we fight traffic and things of this nature day after day for such purposes? We get more and more tired, more and more worn out. The telephone exists, and these problems can be solved in a simpler manner. So if we are having a lot of tension problems, one of the things we must do is reduce areas of unnecessary activity. If it is needed, sit down quietly and talk these things over with the persons involved. Explain the facts, explain your own limitations of energy and time, and let it sit there. If people are at all interested in us, if they are real friends, they will want to do what they can to make life easier for us and not for the continuous satisfaction of their own demands. The demanding friend is a very doubtful value, and our way of life now makes it necessary for us to decide these things. Otherwise, we will go on until we crack up under the strain of unnecessary situations. Suppose we make the 60-mile trip both ways to visit this friend. What is actually achieved? Probably nothing for anyone involved. If we were in the old times when we had leisure, when we lived nearer together, an evening of simple friendliness was probably worth its cost simply for the community of interests and activities. Today, this type of attitude is no longer very real. We make the 60-mile trip and reach a place to find a dozen people assembled as though for a wake. No one knows what to say. No one has anything to say. The only situation that will loosen it up is a series of cocktails. And by the time everyone has had several, they do not know what to say, but they're saying it anyway. And the whole situation degenerates into small talk, trivia, and even worse. And a few of the belligerent neurotics get into trouble before the evening is over. This is considered to be a social grace. In most instances, it's a disgrace. Until the art of friendship, until the art of conversation has been rediscovered, there is really very little to be gained by these safaris into the unknown hinterland in search of our acquaintances. The same is true of the daily problems of living, in the home, in the office, in the family. The simple answer to most conditions or most situations is to take the difficulties out of them as quickly as possible. One way to take out difficulties is to get over the whole concept of procrastination. Never let anything pile up that can be taken care of immediately. In business, it is very important to prevent things from accumulating, building backlogs of various kinds. It is also necessary in handling other people to get over the belief that today we have a right to expect extraordinary efficiency from anyone. If we put too much dependence on other people's judgment or on their industry, we are going to have further causes for trouble. The only way to solve this problem is to recognize that we cannot afford to be disappointed because other people do not turn out well. We must expect them not to. Keeping a very quiet, suspended judgment, but not expecting more than is probable. For wherever we expect too much, we're in for further disillusionment, misery, and perhaps extra work trying to correct situations which have gone bad. Everywhere, then, in our modern way of life, we have to keep efficiency and happiness and peace of mind in our own names. We have to develop attitudes which are quiet enough and strong enough and big enough to enclose this confusion without becoming confused. If the individual will take a few simple lessons in creating habits, he will find that he can gain a great deal of peace of mind. Look over your day from the morning until the end of the day and try to determine for yourselves the difficult spots that are most likely to appear. Whether it is a matter of haste at a certain point, with the American businessman, for example, one cause of tension is a late start in the morning. The individual waits to the last possible moment and then has to fight traffic all the way to his destination. He fights so hard that he uses much too much energy struggling with freeways, struggling with last-minute haste. If he started a few minutes earlier, he would not have this sense of drive that creates psychic fatigue. He won't admit this. He won't admit that it bothers him at all. I've heard hundreds of people tell me that there's nothing more relaxing to them than freeway driving. It may be that it's like the individual who says there's nothing that picks me up like the fifth drink. And this is exactly the case, because by the fifth drink he doesn't know what is picking him up. And there's this business of freeway driving being a great source of psychic satisfaction is quite untrue. Tests made have indicated beyond doubt that it is a greater strain on the heart than launching a man into orbit. So if the person would start a little earlier, be contented to drive a little less rapidly, and avoid heavy congestion areas in every way possible, he might take a little longer to get to his destination, but he would not have worked near the hardship on his neurocardiac system. He would not have endangered the heart tension, which in time will accumulate, and he will have a coronary, and he will never know why. But planning could help him not to have this happen. Another problem that he has to face in business is his lunch hour. The lunch hour represents a minor crisis. We're beginning to recognize this, however, and in time probably will be able to handle it more wisely. But the individual should think through his lunch hour, not only what he eats and the quality of food he is most likely to be able to get, but the amount of relaxation or letdown he is going to achieve by this. And if he's wise, he will not try to support his afternoon's work with alcohol at noon, because he is only going to have to fight it later, whether he realizes it or not. This pickup that he talks about is not a vitality at all. It is purely a toxicity, and someday he will have to live with that. The same problem is getting home. If the individual will plan these things more carefully, he can save a tremendous amount of energy in the course of the day. And as it is true of the man, so it is true of the woman in connection with her daily activities. If she is in business, her problems are very similar to those of the man in these respects. If she has home situations to contend with, she has to recognize the importance of taking the tension out of activity. Of both the man and the woman, the same thing can be true. Neither one is really interested in the job. The woman is not interested in housework. The man is not interested in the field of business in which he is engaged. He is simply working to make a living. Where this lack of genuine interest exists, all problems become a little more difficult because there is no payment in self-satisfaction. And self-satisfaction is a more important coin of the realm than we have ever recognized. So under the pressure of irritation, the tendency is to delay, to procrastinate, or to go after things in leaps and jumps rather than in a quiet, smooth, well-calculated manner. The taking of the time element out of activity is rather a help in connection with doing things. If we can just keep on quietly doing them, we will suddenly discover that they are done. Whereas if we start timing them and start grudging every moment expended in them, we will develop a fine emotional tension before the day is finished. Of course, one of the great tensions in families is the young people with their problems coming along all the time. And for these tensions, there are very few remedies that can be considered classical. But most experts in the field recognize that children by nature are comparatively normal, but that they build their patterns from their elders. A family in which there is high nervous tension will communicate this to children inevitably. The tense, nagging parent is going to end with tense, nagging, irritating children. Now, this does not follow 100% as a remedy, because children have other associations than parents, and it is very difficult to cope with this particular area. But it is reasonably certain that it will be improved to a marked degree if the parent is irritation-free. Now, many people will say it's all right to be talking about irritation-free, but with these children you cannot be irritation-free. Well, the only answer to that is you can make a good try. And most people have either given up making a good try or never did. It is a matter of accepting these pressures into yourself without being pressure-ridden as the result. It's a matter of the same principle that underlies judo. That is, not to create tension against tension, but to try as far as possible to accept tension in a state of complete relaxation. If you do this, you will not get into very serious difficulty. A sleepwalker can go along the edge of a roof without any danger of falling off, actually, because of the tremendous sense of subconscious security that comes from unconsciousness. This person can do incredible things. If he is awakened suddenly, he is likely to fall. In the same way, if the person is extremely quiet within himself and does not rise to the challenge of irritating conditions, he has more solutional power than he would otherwise have. Also, if the individual can keep this calm code in his own nature, he is not so likely to create new causes of tension in his daily action. A hasty, ill-considered judgment is apt to cause months of tension. The individual finds himself in a situation that he cannot handle adequately, and his troubles multiply. If, however, it is possible for him to be quiet and orderly at the time of making a decision, his own decision will probably be protective of future energy. All decisions made in haste are apt to have unfortunate consequences. These consequences have to be considered in terms of continuous tension. So we can strongly advise that wherever an important decision has to be made, that we examine ourselves at the moment when we make the decision and try to be sure that we are not under pressure. If we are under too much pressure, this is one opportunity in which it is wiser to ask for a brief time to consider the matter. Never permit our momentary pressures often loaded with emotional negations or mental intemperances to operate against the major decisions that we have to make. Otherwise, we will create problems that may last us and burden us for the rest of our lives. Try to get this tension down, then, by breaking the habit of feeling that it is necessary to respond emotionally to every condition that arises. Try to establish a new attitude toward this problem, beginning with some simple situation that occurs frequently, and about which, therefore, you can take a distinct attitude or stand. For instance, supposing you do have such a problem as bolting a breakfast, because you will not start early enough and find the situation irksome. What you are really doing by a late start is usually expressing personal defiance against the place you are going. You don't want to go there. You have to. But to get there at the last possible moment is a kind of semi-revenge. It's the individual's last opportunity to express his dissatisfaction. Try for 3 or 4 weeks, every morning, to be punctually at breakfast 10 or 15 minutes earlier, for the purpose of making certain that you have an adequate time to reach your destination safely, quietly, and without unreasonable pressure. Just make this a forced habit upon yourself. In 3 or 4 weeks, it will no longer be a pressureful habit. You will discover that you are more comfortable, that you arrive at work in a better condition, that the day goes easier in other things, and you will have a new habit. This habit will then set in just as this last-minute rush habit previously set in. And from that time on, it will be comparatively easy and natural and pleasant to make that slightly earlier start, because you will begin to benefit personally from the results of it. Having conquered some small issue of that nature and established a repetitional pattern which will then take care of itself, you will find you will automatically wake up a few minutes earlier, simply because your entire psychic coordination will cooperate. You're likely to discover something else also. When you were struggling with the last-minute situation, you woke up groggy and tired, hating the very thought of getting up. With the new pattern gained by resolution, you may lose 10 minutes sleep, but you will wake up more refreshed and with a positive attitude rather than a negative reluctance, because you have learned to cooperate with some kind of a rule, and nature wants rules, and it wants people to make them, and it wants people to keep them. So your day is likely to go consistently better. Then comes the problem of getting rid of unnecessary losses of energy. If you are in any activity where confusion or lack of method is doubling work, if you're under some kind of a compulsion that forces you to do things that do not need to be done, if you have some kind of a strange attitude that is not consistent with facts or truths, try to find out what it is and correct it for your own good and the good of other people. Because as you get tired and tense, you will certainly take part of the joy of life out of the lives of people around you. Now, there are several different ways in which to approach this. For instance, you might possibly be one of these chronic telephoners. With a house full of things to do, you settle down on the phone for 2 hours. This creates a poor situation. Added up, the 2 hours mean nothing. When you try to figure out what you were talking about, a few minutes later you can't remember anything. It was a habit, really, a habit perhaps of procrastinating something. Nearly all useless habits are escape habits of some nature, trying to help the individual justify himself in not doing things he would rather not do, or to push off decisions which he does not want to make. The moment you, for instance, do the 3 or 4 things that you should have done before you telephoned, you will probably find you've lost interest in telephoning. You will cut the conversations much shorter, because actually it wasn't the conversation on the phone. It was the prospect of being able to be dilatory with a reasonably good conscience that really was behind the whole thing. Taking hold, therefore, of the problems that need doing and working them through with modern methodology, the individual can usually, quietly and efficiently take care of the responsibilities that are his in a reasonably short time, much shorter than the time available in most cases. One reason for lack of efficiency, in addition to this procrastinating instinct, is our inability to use wisely the time that we save by efficiency. This is quite an important issue these days. There's really no use in going through housework like a cyclone or like an army regimented group, getting everything in spick and span condition in an hour and a half, and then spending the rest of the day in front of the television. This doesn't add up to anything. Usually we become efficient and become well organized for some reason. We want to do something else with the time we've saved. At this time, the American people does not seem to know what it wants to do with any time that it saves. It has no sincere, integrated purposes. So another phase of getting over tension pressures is to find these other interests, by means of which we have special incentives to make life as orderly as possible. If we are able to save an hour or 2 hours by efficient planning, what are we going to do with these? Are we going to waste them in something else? If these 2 hours are not very meaningful in themselves, then our impulse to save them will lack intensity. We will say it really doesn't make much difference whether I save this time or not. I'm not going to do anything important with it. On the other hand, if something looms ahead that is of the greatest meaning and greatest satisfaction to our natures, then we have incentive to organization. The same problem extends over long life planning. If we can plan with the realization that our lives after 60 are going to be very largely the consequences of how we used or wasted energy before we were 60, we would have a little more organized reason for disciplining our own intensities. But this problem never arises in our minds until we are 60. And by that time, we have done a majestic job of wasting the energy. So long-range planning and the desire to remain healthy, to keep away from unnecessary doctor's bills and the like, all these things could give us incentives for balancing off the processes of living. But unfortunately, we are not inclined to look that far ahead. We are satisfied merely to live from day to day. And as a result of that, we are dying day by day through the waste and misuse of the resources of life itself. So let's try and see whether we can't get a break in this pattern through a series of rather natural procedures. One of these procedures, as we have suggested, is to try to organize our activities in a non-tension pattern. Now, beside this problem of giving the extra time to some situations, This means giving extra thought to other situations and bestowing a little more emotional integrity to still other situations. Of course, habits, because they arise very largely within us, are dominated by memory situations to a considerable degree. And one cause of tension can be memory. The individual remembers some situation or condition that was unpleasant and settles down to nurse memories. Nature punishes these people very, very heavily, because nature causes these individuals to gradually develop neurotic tendencies which destroy their contemporary adjustment. They are no longer able to get along now because of the pressures of these other situations. So we can say, how shall we forget conditions which have hurt us? How are we going to get over these grudges which keep us in the dumps so much of the time? We just can't afford them, any more than we can afford the doctor's bills, which we must sometimes pay if we keep on with these grudges. The thoughtful person realizes that negative memories about people, antagonisms against people, these do not pay off in any respect whatever. Actually, the more negative attitudes we hold against other people, the more we hurt ourselves and not the other people. At one time, perhaps, we believed in some kind of a telepathy in which if we hated a man enough, we made him uncomfortable. Now we realize that if we hate him enough, we make ourselves sick, and he doesn't even know we exist. So there is very little benefit to be gained from the process. We are simply hurting ourselves in an effort to hurt somebody else. Recognizing that there is no benefit in this procedure, we are reminded of the Greek philosopher who said that the only way we can revenge ourselves against our enemy is to live better than he does. And if we will do that, we have nothing else to worry about. He will die of jealousy. If, however, we live worse than he does, committing the same fault ourselves that we have convicted him of committing, then, if anything, we give him a certain amount of satisfaction, which is usually not the basic intention. So we have to fight out these problems of long memories and attachments and things of this nature, which can become confusing and sources of tension. Zen has the best answer to that I know of, and that is the recognition that all of these pressures belong completely to attitude mechanisms, that they do not arise in us. When we say, for example, I like someone, we are not sure whether we like them or whether some neural complex likes them. When we say that we must have this, we simply mean our desires must have this. The self point in these attitudes is extremely attenuated. We're not very sure about it. We know that we want what we want, but we really do not know what it is that wants it. And Zen takes the attitude that these are simply intensities built up by the combinations of faculty patterns, and that actually the individual in the soul of himself is relatively desireless. The only thing that we really want in the very deepest part of our own nature is we want truth. We want the infinite wisdom and the infinite love that proceed from the universe itself. We want to know our God, and in so doing know ourselves in the deepest parts of our beings. These probably are about our only great spiritual desires. The rest of this longing and yearning within ourselves is a pure selfishness on some level. It is the individual simply wanting what he wants and not what he needs. So Zen takes the attitude that the person who reduces his desires reduces the power of attitude to destroy him. We are all destroyed and exhausted by attitudes. So we have to settle down a little bit and find out how much good these attitudes are, whether there's anything about them that really is worth saving. Philosophy has to come into this, but philosophy by itself will not do it. Of course, a certain percentage of persons confronted by philosophy, which appears to be reasonable and intelligent, are more or less affected by it, and gain from this sensing of the practical value of thinking the encouragement to go on and do some constructive thinking themselves. So philosophy gives an impulse towards achievement, but it has to be sustained by the direct decision of the person himself. Otherwise it will not operate. But if philosophy suggests to us very strongly that many of the addictions and attitudes that we hold are comparatively valueless, and that the most commonly held are the least valuable, perhaps it would help us to moderate some of our attitudes and prepare ourselves for more simple living in the future. Life itself is constantly striving in this direction, and most older people want to simplify living. They find that the old pressures and the old habits, the old practices, are simply no longer possible under energy limitation, and they want to adjust to a comfortable pattern of life. Young people, because they have more energy, feel that they can expend it more generously. But even in the younger person today, the demands are so great that some discrimination must be cultivated, or the person may not live to graduate from college. The intensities are just that great. So having come to a philosophical conclusion about these situations, I think the next thing the individual should consider, especially if he is showing wear and tear, is how he can reduce the overall amount of energy required for his day of activity. What can he drop out of the day without losing anything himself or really depriving anybody else of anything? Of course, this is a big question and it's a big answer, for the simple reason that most people could drop most of the day on that basis. But this isn't likely to happen, but it is possible that we can begin to see things that we do that really do not require the amount of time or energy we bestow on them. There are certain conditions that arise every day which could be simplified, distant and separate activities that could be combined. Something can be done to take some of the pressure out of living. Always, of course, pressure arises with last-minute decisions or last-minute activity. So it is far wiser to get rid of this tendency of things to pile up against a deadline. If you can prevent this, you will save a great deal of energy. There are various ways of trying to consider how life can be simplified. Television is not a relaxing factor for most people. It creates more nerve tension. We are tense because we don't like the programs and bitterly complain about them, or we are intense because the programs themselves dramatize so intensely various emotional and mental difficulties of people that we simply become listeners in a clinic of some nature. We do not always remember also that these stories are manufactured. After a while we begin to assume that this is the kind of a world we live in. It may be that such instances do occur, but the television makes them seem much too common and much too available in our own life patterns. So here is something that is not always the blessed relaxation that we had hoped it might be. Therefore, it is not a good way to let down. It is not a proper method for the best relaxation. Another problem that can come into this whole situation is our religious attitude. For most persons, even today, religion is a relaxing force, unless the person becomes a fanatic. Under normal religious association, the individual sets aside a certain amount of time to worship or to thoughtfulness in religious matters, gives a little attention to the possibility of their children receiving basic religious education, and all in all, unless the person is overly emotionally devout, religion is a quieting, rather sympathetic, rather ennobling, pacifying type of experience. It is also a constant reminder of those basic virtues which, if practiced, will remove causes of potential tension, because the individual who is practicing these virtues simply and directly is relieving himself of causes which might lead to dissatisfaction and misery in the future. The possibility of the individual achieving periods of time in which to do nothing in a constructive manner is also important. The person who can sit down quietly and have an interesting experience with himself for a few minutes every day will benefit greatly from this experience if he is capable of maintaining it. If you are able to sit down quietly for half an hour, relax, and turn your attention to some abstract but constructive inner value, if you can use this time to understand or sympathetically adjust more directly with life, if you can use this time to think through the situations that might be difficult and to establish a pattern of natural law behind your own conduct and resolve how these things will be simply, honorably, and correctly handled, all this very quietly with a strong sense of internal leadership over conduct and over problem, if you can do this, you will save yourself the grave probabilities of nervous breakdowns. Because the person who can be quiet for a few minutes and enjoy it, who can have communion with themselves and not resent it, who can have a heart-to-heart talk with themselves without being bored to death, when you can achieve this end, it means that your subconscious life is in pretty fair shape. Also, it means the availability of inner resource without tension. If you can quietly sit down and solve problems from within yourself by calling upon your own resources, you will learn two important lessons. First, that this is the way all problems must finally be solved. And second, you will have reasons for increasing natural resources in order to have great and more immediate solving power in problem. You build your inner resources through study, through thoughtfulness, through living, through appreciation, through all types of constructive mental and emotional exercises and experiences. Therefore, the value of philosophy becomes immediately obvious when you have to call upon it inside of yourself to help you solve problems. If you cannot sit down quietly for a half an hour and do nothing as far as objective things are concerned, if you cannot live quietly within yourself, if you cannot find a half an hour of quietude, a relaxing, pleasant, releasing, and largely vitalizing experience, then you are already on the fringe of trouble and had better give the matter a lot more consideration. The person who cannot relax inside, who cannot let down when the opportunity to let down is present, has already built too much pressure mechanism. He can't unwind. is the kind of person that can only unwind by means of some form of sedation. And this is not good. This is a very poor indication of inner stability. So if you sit down someday and try to do this, and find that you do not succeed very well, that in a few minutes you are so nervous you can't stand it another moment, that there's nothing that exhausts you like trying to relax, then you want to think this through pretty carefully. Also, if you have built all kinds of defenses against relaxation, if you take the attitude that I know some people take, who say that the only individual who relaxes in these times is stupid, this type of attitude is simply a defense against your own inability. It has nothing to do with the virtues and values of the situation. Now, it is obvious that there's no use trying to relax if it takes such a tremendous amount of pressure that you're likely to have a nervous breakdown doing it. This certainly is not the answer. But again, relaxation is a habit and an attitude. So you start in doing the best you can. Perhaps you start in and find that after 5 minutes you have exhausted your power to keep quiet. If so, accept this as the pattern and continue it daily, every day, at a regular time, until you are able to create a habit. Until finally you will be able to extend this period of quietude by exercising your own faculties, until at last it assumes some reasonable proportion, which for the average person is a half hour. Now, if you try to use this as an escape and try to relax 24 hours a day, you will be just as bad off as you were before you started. We are creatures of excess. We do nothing moderately. We take the attitude if a little is good, more is better. And this is not true in all things. We are not out to try to keep quiet for 24 hours a day. We are out in an effort to create an adjustment with life, which corresponds to the old meditation processes of ancient religion and philosophy. In fact, it corresponds very closely with the Christian concept of prayer. It is a period set aside for the communion of the individual with the universal value around which his life has to be built. So we use this perhaps in an effort to find out what the inside of ourselves really wants of us. We try to create a bridge between the objective and the subjective. We want the peace and quietude in our own natures to come through. But we refuse to allow this period to become obsessed by our own negations. We immediately reject all negative patterns out of this period. We will not permit it to be a half hour of worry or a half hour of self-pity or a half hour of grievances. Here we have to create our own self-discipline. The moment our minds turn to any negation, we have to rationalize ourselves out of this negation or break the timing entirely and discontinue for that day. We cannot permit this time to be set aside to self-centered pressures. The purpose is always the same, to find the universal truth in the thing, which will usually point out the fault in what we are doing. If children are started out in life with this type of pattern, even if it's only 5 or 10 minutes a day, of quietude to themselves, to think through in themselves their own ways of life, I think most people would find it a very practical and useful experience. And children, for the most part, enjoy this period because it comes to symbolize their own right to be themselves, rather than to be constantly under the influence and dominance of other people. In these moments, no one else is dominating them. They are leading themselves. And perhaps in these moments, questions will arise which the parents will later have to help them answer. but it is a period of exploring self. And this is always a very good period for everyone to cultivate. Another factor that is important in our living always is that we must have a certain participation and sharing in creativity. One of the great problems that we have now is this regimentation of effort. The individual is not able to express his own creative instincts. He is not permitted to express his own artistic impulses unless he happens to be engaged in an aesthetic profession. For the most part, he is living within a very humdrum pattern in which most of the natural, intuitive gentility of himself is obscured. And today women are moving also more and more into this industrial pattern, and one of these days they will have to begin to defend the aesthetic instincts in their own natures from the corruption of circumstances. But in any event, the creativity which makes life individual, which causes the individual the intense satisfaction of personal contribution, this has to be saved and redeemed in some manner. So whatever line of activity we are in, the problem of tension is best solved by the gradual establishment of some kind of a compensatory secondary activity. We often think of this in connection with retirement, that the individual is going to retire and do some of the things he's always wanted to do. It would be better to simplify life now, to live on a less extravagant basis, to free as far as we can our lives from the indebtedness and responsibility which forces us to a condition of tension. And from a simpler point of view, try to compensate the creative side of our own lives. Now there must be and can be something that every person can do that will express his own individuality. If what he is doing in business is expressing his only individuality, then he is in trouble. He will not want any avocational interest, considering his business both his vocation and his avocation, and he is gradually going to develop a very great psychic imbalance. The same is true in the home, where the home becoming both the activity and the avocation, there is trouble. But in the home there is greater diversity of activity in most cases, so the trouble is not so obvious. Actually, the person must have compensatory activities. He must have not only the development of concrete mental faculties, he must have the stimulation of abstract, creative mental emotional faculties. Thus, ingenuity, creativity, originality must be considered, and the person must learn to think creatively rather than merely from the memory patterns of experience and the traditional profession in which he finds himself. Creative thought is necessary to life, and certainly it is necessary to healthy life. And creative thought breaks down very rapidly the tensions set up by thought habit mechanisms that have no individuality in them. So we recommend any form of activity in which the individual does independent thinking, particularly activity that is apart from the general intensity of life. Now, we all know persons who are riding mental specialties to death. And they are with them, they are also riding their personal lives to destruction. The individual who simply has only one interest, and lives and dies for that interest. He may be a success in his chosen field, but he is not very successful as a person. He is sacrificing too much of his individuality and is ultimately going to work a great hardship on others. All of these very self-centered, situation-centered, interest-centered people have a tendency to be very selfish. As a result of this tremendous intensity, the individual has to neglect something. And the best way to become highly neurotic by specialization is to graduate from a specialized institution of learning. If you do a little postgraduate work in one of our universities, I can almost guarantee you a nervous breakdown. It may not occur immediately, but it will come. First of all, whatever course you have taken, the professors from the beginning take the attitude, whether spoken or unspoken, that there is no other thing in the universe worth knowing. That's final. Whatever it is, if it's physics or electrodynamics or whatever it is, the universe moves around this axis. You have it fed to you. It is variously thrown at you. It overwhelms you. You are expected to cheerfully and willingly devote every evening of your life to further research in this problem. You are assured that by the time you graduate, you'll probably have to start over because there'll be so much more information available. You find that 8 or 10 years of higher mathematics will not get you through the maze. That takes another 4 years. And by that time, many persons are unemployable through natural causes, decrepitude, or extreme age. But you finally graduate from this institution with a specialty. And actually, this specialty is a kind of vampire that has taken over your entire life and consciousness. You are, therefore, perhaps employable, but generally now the first thing the employer does after reading your application and finding that you come from the correct background is to employ you and turn you over for 3 years of special training in their factory before you know what you're supposed to do. This goes on until you drop dead. There is really no end to it. Every 10 years a brusher-upper and you do 2 more years of something. And at the present rate of progress, 10 years will be too long. And work will be an occasional break in schooling, because we will have this situation which is becoming obsessional. No one knows when to stop or where to stop. And if we keep on doing this without ever knowing when to stop, we will keep on inventing this and inventing that until we blow up the whole laboratory, which seems to be what everyone is trying to work toward. Under such specialization, tension, neurosis are inevitable. The person has no time to live. He is not supposed to live. He is supposed to advance the destiny of knowledge. And about the time he thinks he's got it advanced, somebody changes the whole direction and he's out of style. He is supposed to be adding infinitely to the joy of the future, and now very few people have much faith in the future anyway. But it goes on. These persons have a terrible amount of pressure to unwind. They have been built up to such a tension in the process of trying to learn that they have lost all inner values. They cannot keep quiet. They cannot create adequate homes. Their homes become laboratories and machine shops for the job they're doing at work. They expect their whole families to talk their language, a language which is not only meaningless to most people, but worthless even to those who talk it in the majority of cases. This tension problem someone has to take hold of, or it is going to become very painful in the years that lie ahead as we produce more and more of these highly technically neurotic people. The only answer is that each life where this occurs faces its own emergencies. After a couple of poor marriages or a tragedy or two, the individual may take a second look at himself. He may realize that he is completely off the ground as far as his values are concerned. But then he has so little to build with. He may not have had much family life in childhood. He had no help in education and nothing but the most perverse conditioning in business. Out of all of these situations, he's supposed to build happiness. There's only one way he can do it, and that is to take a very powerful control of his own life. If he has a good enough mind to attempt the trisection of a right angle or something of that nature, he must have a good enough mind to think his own life through properly. If he doesn't do it, his reward will be a continuing pattern of tragedy, failure, and unhappiness. There is no way he can avoid these things, because he has nothing within himself that has been developed to meet the challenge of a well-balanced life. What he didn't get, he's got to get for himself. And he can do it, but again, it takes this self-determination, this self-discipline, which we must impose upon our own natures if we are going to break down the pressure and tension patterns which so pester us and annoy us today. Another thing that will help with a great deal of tension is a non-competitive attitude toward other people. This desperate effort to try to surpass everyone else on the economic level of living naturally creates tension. Debt creates tension. Unnecessary responsibilities, which we have taken on only for vanity, may be the tensions that ultimately break us down. So the person has to realize that the more he enslaves himself to the popular patterns of the time, the more tension he must inevitably carry. Gradually, I think society is going to come in with some answers to these larger questions, but for the present we must also solve these ourselves if we expect to have a solution that is workable. Sometime we have to decide whether we are going to die for our patterns or try to get out of some of these patterns with a reasonable amount of life left in our own natures. We cannot win this fight. As time goes on, as years go on, the successes which we achieve have to pass from us anyway. The most that we can call the ultimate success is a large estate, in which the individual leaves a considerable sum of money for the government and his heirs to spend as they see fit, usually not the way he would have preferred. This is about the end of the wealth pattern. Fame is about the same thing. Very few individuals have any reasonable right to hope to achieve immortality through distinction. They may be remembered in their communities for a while, they may be remembered by their friends and relatives for a few years, but with the passing of a generation, all living memories of people disappear also. And with the exception of a few great historical personalities, fame vanishes within 100 years, never to be found again. All of these ends, therefore, are extremely short-lived. They do not give us any ultimate security. Is it not better that we think well of ourselves today than that we hope our friends will be proud of us 100 years from now? Or is there any real difference in this? Is it not finally the individual who achieves his own integration who has the greatest chance of being remembered? If there is any fame, it will ultimately be given to those who are by nature superior. And superiority is not measured in terms of wealth, but in terms of internal integrity. So the person who is sacrificing peace of mind, happiness, and health in a desperate effort to keep up with his neighbors is just simply foolish. There is nothing to be gained by it. Now, many people admit this, but they will not make the break that indicates the real acceptance of the facts. Now, there are ways that you can get around this also and start making certain breaks which will help toward this end. And that is, if you have arrived at a certain level of status due to your employment or your natural means or funds, the first thing to do is to determine within yourself that if you have arrived at a satisfactory level, that there you are going to stay. That you're not going to sell out next year to get into the bigger place, which is going to be more trouble, more stress, more debt, more status, and more sponging on the part of neo-friends. In other words, don't continue this success drive. And if it reaches a point where you could do a little better if you insisted, or you could live in a more expensive house, hold back and stay in the one you're in. This is one way of defeating the drive against a continuous habit which will go on till you die, because no matter what you do move into, it will soon be inadequate. You might as well be dissatisfied where you are. This may give you enough money so that you can pay bills and cut down other worries. Your friends may not fully approve of what you're doing, but you do not necessarily approve of what they're doing. And finally, the more important thing to you is that you have what they do not have, and that is a lack of debt. That you are not under the pressure that they are insisting upon assuming, so that you will be the one who will be sitting quietly at home when you read in the paper about their coronary. And you might just as well be, because if you get the coronary, they're not going to take over your load for you, simply because you were doing what they recommended or following their example. Society is not going to pay your bills if society's pressures have made you sick. So the answer is to take hold of the problem and block it somewhere. If you have not achieved a reasonable standard of living, when you do achieve it, then also stop. Stop rather than to go on to the last desperate moment. Be satisfied to do what frequently is not done, where very few people ever stop to enjoy what they have achieved. The achievement becomes a mania, and they keep on pressing until the very end of life. This is a certain way to ruin happiness and peace of soul. Also, another thing that will help a great many people against the financial pressure is something that has failed badly among us in the recent generations, and that is personal ingenuity. One way to save money, which may cut down worry, is to learn to do more things yourself. In the years gone by, the ingenious person was regarded with great favor. Today, we take the attitude that he is a penny pincher. We take the attitude today that handmade things indicate that we do not have the money to buy commercially made things. And instead of the pride going to the handmade product, we penalize it unless it is a luxury. Then we consider it magnificent. If we have to pay $50 a yard to hand weave some cloth for ourselves, we're geniuses. We're folk artists. But if we mend a teapot, we're too cheap to buy a new one. And when you go in with the guarantee that only lasted 1 week when it was supposed to last a year, the dealer looks at you and says, "Oh, why don't you buy another one, you cheapskate?" You are expected to throw away anything that is not in perfect working order, and you expect in yourself that nothing that you buy will operate very long. This is a very bad attitude and naturally creates a lot of unpleasantness, tension, disagreeable reaction, and causes the person frequently to expend more than he should. The person who is ingenious should receive the highest possible public acclaim. The person who can do things themselves and do them skillfully stands as witness to achievement, because we were created to do things. We were given hands and feet in order that we could do things. We're given minds in order that we can learn how to do them. This business of work being reserved for the poor and the forlorn, and that the do-nothing is the gentleman, or if he does anything, it has to be unimportant. This is part of our pattern leading to nervous breakdowns. The person who is interested in learning and doing gets a great deal of expression out of it. Another interesting point is that the average individual who is thinking reasonably well can do almost anything except extremely technical projects. If he is entirely out of his depth, perhaps, in a very complicated transistor pattern or something of that nature. But the average person with common sense can take care of things, mend them, fix them, put them together, and finally be just about as good as an expert. Because after all, the expert is also only doing the common sense thing. And if we have this instinct of common sense in ourselves, we'll know how things should be done. And we exercise these faculties. We get creative self-expression. And this is always important. So we have outlets in these areas. Instead of getting nervous, fix it. And you will find that the interest in doing this will give a great deal of relaxation and self-expression. And if we win this little tussle with some unknown equipment and do fix it, there is a little bit of justifiable pride. The individual who has mended something skillfully has a right to be far more proud than the other person who goes out and spends a lot of money for a new one. He has created something. He has expressed some value within himself. In all matters involving tension, then, we have to head into these situations and create new patterns. We have to attempt a way of life which we feel will correct the situation, and we have to actively do this new thing for 30 days. If we decide that we need a different relationship with life, we will force ourselves, even if we have to write it in large letters on the wall, to do this particular thing for 30 days. At the end of 30 days, a habit will have been created. And from then on, it will become increasingly easy to do the thing right instead of wrong. If we simply forbid ourselves to indulge in self-pity for 30 days and turn the mind immediately by effort for that period of 30 days, whenever self-pity arises, we decide to pick up a good book and read. We decide to look into some obscure form of knowledge that we think would help us. Or we decide on a conscious activity in which we are doing something for someone or to help some principle or cause. For 30 days, we automatically frustrate the self-pity mechanism. It takes a minute or two to do it because this mechanism will arise constantly. But for 30 days, we fight it off. At the end of the 30 days, the fight is over. We've won it. And we find that it is automatic, that when we start to feel this self-pity, we will instinctively turn to one of the other thought patterns that we have created. We will shout for the way out. We will demand it instead of falling back into the old pattern. So wherever you find a cause in your daily life in which you are convinced that you have a serious energy loss, that in some way something is happening every day that keeps you depressed, irritated, nagged, then quietly sit down and think this thing through. Force yourself to figure out what would cure it. How could you change the situation constructively, not by evasion, but by constructiveness, and get away from it, get out from under this particular situation? You need to have a quiet talk with someone whose conduct is becoming too difficult. Do you need to make some change in the normal social habits that you have? You need to drop an acquaintance who is a loss rather than a help. Do you need to get out of a pattern into new activities? Find out what it is that will break that situation, and then give it the 30-day treatment. By the end of that time, your problem will be under control, and with it will be the lowering of this tension rate. Nearly all problems can be solved by ordinary common sense. It is seldom, if ever, necessary that some elaborate clinical diagnosis be applied to the daily situations that confront the individual. He can solve them himself if he will quietly think them through. He has the endowments within his own nature to make the decisions that will make life better for him. He has to take the time, however, to recognize the cause of the trouble and institute a pattern of correction. He will have to fight the problem for 30 days, which will not be too difficult because he's already been fighting it negatively, perhaps for years. If he really believes he can get out of something in a short time that has plagued him for a long time, he should not find the task impossible. Because we have found in working with people that most habits can be pretty well dented in 30 days. If the person is really sincere for that period of time. Even an alcoholic, if he is really sincere, can make a tremendous step toward recovery in 30 days. May take a little longer to finish it off. But from that time on, he is working with a positive allotment of attainment to help him. And this is true with the person working with a character defect or a pressure or a situation. If the situation is one that cannot easily be solved by the individual, then turn immediately to the proper source of help. Make part of the plan that if you know that help is needed, that you will go to that help immediately and use the 30 days to follow the recommendations that are given. No more procrastination. No more putting off of the meeting of a situation with personal, positive confidence and creativity. If you will work with your problems this way and never let them bog down, the moment you see a poor habit, handle it as you would a dangerous symptom. Immediately have the proper examination and remedy recommended. Never let these negative patterns of pressure move in on you. If you can keep your own temperament quiet and smooth, you can handle all the pressure you are likely to face. But you cannot if you once allow this pressure to defeat your own inner peace of mind. And peace of mind is not really affected by pressure, but by your willingness to lose your peace of mind in becoming actively involved in an unnecessary pressure situation. Keep with this. Never allow any pressure pattern to go unnoticed. The moment you feel tension, the moment you find situations getting too big for you, stop instantly and examine the situations. Find out why. Find out what you are doing to make them worse. Find out what you could do to solve them. And then very quietly and without tension or pressure and without theatrics or drama, cut the foundation out from under these problems by correcting their causes. If you do this, the problem itself will dissolve. If you have certain adjustments to make, adjust to them graciously. This is the answer to solution. Many people will find that if a situation is unsatisfactory, but at that moment unchangeable, if they will be quiet, if they will accept it, if they will be peaceful in it as it is, they have the greatest probability of the situation finally turning more favorably. Because tension and pressure solve nothing. Impatience solves nothing. The thing that solves is always the quiet, well-method arrangement by which we accept the responsibility, meet it graciously, accept it kindly, and quietly plan the solution. If we do that, we will save a great deal of doctor's bills. We will have many more real friends. We will have closer families, a little cash in the bank, and a greater degree of security in the future. We have to build these values ourselves. No one else is going to build them for us under the conditions under which we now live. Well, time is up, so we'll have to stop.